Ma'am, the economy boarding line is actually over there with the rest of your kind. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke delivered with a smile so perfectly rehearsed it could have been carved from ice. But Dr. Jasmine Washington had heard worse in her 34 years of life, and she certainly wasn't going to let this perfectly coiffed flight attendant with her platinum blonde hair swept into an impossibly tight chignon be the one to break her composure on this particular Tuesday morning at JFK Terminal 5. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that made everyone look slightly green and tired, mixing with the scent of burnt coffee and that indefinable airport smell of stressed humanity and industrial cleaning products that seemed to permeate every major travel hub in America. Jasmine stood there in her deliberately chosen outfit, a faded Howard University sweatshirt that had seen better days paired with well-worn jeans that had the kind of softness that only came from years of washing and sneakers that looked like they'd walked through more than a few puddles. Her natural hair pulled back in the simplest ponytail she could manage without any of the careful styling that usually accompanied her professional appearances. To anyone giving her a casual glance, she looked exactly like what she wanted to appear to be a tired graduate student, or perhaps a young professional flying on a budget, someone who definitely didn't belong in the first-class boarding line that she was currently occupying with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was doing here. But appearances, as Jasmine had learned through years of working as a senior safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, could be more deceptive than a funhouse mirror, and the battered leather backpack slung over her shoulder contained not textbooks or personal belongings, but rather a collection of recording devices, documentation materials, and most importantly, the federal credentials that gave her the authority to ground any aircraft in American airspace if she deemed it necessary for the safety and security of the flying public. Today's mission was what the FAA called a ghost ride, an unannounced covert audit of Meridian Airways' premium service standards and compliance protocols triggered by a series of anonymous whistleblower complaints that had made their way up the chain of command complaints that painted a disturbing picture of discriminatory treatment patterns among certain senior cabin crew members. The boarding pass in her phone displayed Seat 4B in first class, purchased with taxpayer money, specifically to ensure that she would experience the full range of service offerings that Meridian Airways promised to their premium passengers. And as she stood there listening to the gate agent's announcement crackling through speakers that had seen better decades, she couldn't help but notice the way other passengers moved through the priority boarding process with the kind of entitlement that money could buy and discrimination could reinforce. Victoria Sterling Hayes had been perfecting her smile for 20 years, the kind of smile that could freeze champagne or melt the resistance of difficult passengers depending on what the situation required. And this morning she stood at her post near the jet bridge, like a sentinel guarding the gates of heaven. Her Meridian Airways uniform tailored to within an inch of its life and pressed with military precision, every silver button polished to a mirror shine that reflected the terminal's harsh lighting back at anyone who dared to look too closely. At 42, she had earned her reputation as the Ice Queen of the Atlantic routes, a title that she wore with considerable pride, though she preferred to think of herself as someone who simply understood the importance of maintaining proper standards in an industry that had, in her considered opinion, become far too casual about the natural order of things. Her platinum blonde hair was swept back in a chignon so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, giving her face a perpetual look of mild disapproval that had been carefully cultivated over 2 decades of dealing with what she considered to be the declining quality of air travelers. And her makeup was applied with the precision of a portrait artist, every line and shadow designed to project an image of unattainable perfection that served as both armor and weapon in her daily battles to maintain what she saw as the dignity of commercial aviation. Victoria came from the kind of old money that whispered rather than shouted, the kind of family that had been flying first class since before most airlines even existed. And she had taken this job not out of financial necessity, but out of a genuine belief that she could serve as a guardian of proper behavior and appropriate social boundaries 30,000 feet above the ground, where the rules of engagement were different and where someone needed to ensure that certain standards were maintained, regardless of what society might say about equality and inclusion and all those other modern concepts that seemed designed to blur the lines that had once been so clearly drawn. Standing beside her, trying to look busy with his pre-flight checklist, David Kim shifted nervously from one foot to the other, his 2 years with Meridian Airways having taught him to recognize the signs of Victoria's particular brand of passenger evaluation. The way her eyes would sweep across the boarding queue like a scanner, categorizing and judging and making decisions about who deserved the full measure of her professional courtesy and who would be receiving what she called appropriate service levels. At 26, David had joined the airline with dreams of seeing the world and helping people travel safely. But working under Victoria's supervision had shown him a side of the industry that made him question whether he was in the right profession, though he needed the job too much to speak up about the things he witnessed on an almost daily basis. The moment Jasmine stepped into the priority boarding lane, she felt Victoria's gaze sweep over her like a security scanner, taking in every detail from her scuffed sneakers to her untamed hair, and she could practically see the calculations happening behind those ice-blue eyes, the immediate categorization and dismissal that came so naturally to someone who had spent 2 decades dividing the world into those who belonged and those who most certainly did not. The smile that Victoria had been wearing for the previous passengers evaporated as completely as morning mist, replaced by an expression of barely concealed irritation that she didn't even bother to hide as she gestured toward the economy boarding area with a manicured finger that caught the terminal's fluorescent lighting like a small sword. "I know where I'm supposed to be," Jasmine replied with the kind of calm that came from years of dealing with people who mistook her appearance for her capabilities. Her voice carrying just enough authority to make Victoria's smile falter for a microsecond before snapping back into place like a rubber band. "I'm in Zone 1, first-class boarding." She held up her phone with the digital boarding pass displayed clearly on the screen, the QR code sharp and undeniable against the white background. Though she could see from Victoria's expression that visual evidence was going to be treated as merely a minor inconvenience rather than proof of anything meaningful. Victoria's laugh was like the sound of crystal glasses breaking in slow motion, sharp and brittle and designed to cut, as she made a show of reluctantly reaching for her scanner, with all the enthusiasm of someone being asked to handle something unpleasant. Her movements deliberate and theatrical enough to ensure that the growing line of passengers behind Jasmine could see exactly what was happening and draw their own conclusions about who belonged where in the natural order of things. "Zone 1 is strictly for our first-class and diamond medallion passengers," she said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry to the back of the boarding area, "and I'm sure you understand that we have to be very careful about maintaining the integrity of our premium service offerings." The scanner beeped its electronic protest the first time Victoria waved it vaguely in the direction of Jasmine's phone, a sound that Victoria seemed to interpret as confirmation of her suspicions, rather than evidence of her own reluctance to perform the simple task of properly scanning a boarding pass, and she made a show of shaking her head with practiced disappointment before trying again this time, allowing the device to actually read the QR code that immediately displayed the information that Jasmine had been telling her all along. Seat 4, B, Vance Jasmine First Class. But Victoria's expression didn't change. Not really, because in her worldview, systems could be wrong and computers could be fooled, and there were always explanations for anomalies that didn't fit the natural pattern of how things were supposed to work. So she simply pursed her lips and delivered her verdict with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully challenged in 20 years of making these kinds of decisions. "Upgrade glitch, probably," she announced to the assembled passengers, her tone suggesting that she was sharing insider knowledge about the unreliability of modern technology. "The system's been acting up all morning, giving away seats to people who booked through those discount third-party websites that nobody really monitors properly." The Boeing 7879 stretched before them like a silver cathedral, its premium cabin bathed in soft blue LED lighting, that was designed to create an atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity, with wide leather seats that could transform into fully flat beds and overhead bins, spacious enough to accommodate the garment bags and oversized carry-ons that came with the territory of first-class travel. And as Jasmine made her way down the aisle toward seat 4B, she could feel the weight of curious glances from passengers who had witnessed the boarding gate encounter and were now wondering what the final chapter of that little drama might look like. She settled into her window seat with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of travel, stowing her deliberately shabby backpack under the seat in front of her and pulling out a small notebook that looked like something a college student might use for class notes, but was actually a sophisticated documentation system that she used to record service standards, safety compliance issues, and anything else that might be relevant to her investigation. And as she began to observe the pre-flight service rituals that were supposed to unfold according to very specific FAA-mandated protocols, she could already see the pattern of discrimination beginning to emerge like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Victoria moved through the first-class cabin with the grace of a ballet dancer and the precision of a Swiss watch, her smile brightening and dimming like a lighthouse beacon depending on who she was addressing. And Jasmine watched with professional fascination as the lead purser offered champagne flutes and warm towels to passengers in seats 1A through 4A, engaging in the kind of friendly conversation that made air travel feel personal and special, discussing preferences for the upcoming meal service and asking about connecting flights with the sort of genuine interest that could make someone feel like the most important person in the world. But when Victoria's choreographed dance brought her to row 4, something extraordinary happened. She simply glided past seat 4B as if it were empty, as if Jasmine had somehow become invisible the moment she buckled her seatbelt, continuing her service routine for the passenger in 4C, before turning back toward the galley without so much as acknowledging that someone was sitting in the window seat who might also appreciate a pre-departure beverage or perhaps just the basic courtesy of being recognized as a human being who had paid for first-class service. Dr. Mitchell Hartwell in seat 1. A distinguished-looking man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive watch that suggested he was accustomed to quality service, glanced back toward Jasmine with an expression that seemed to register the deliberate nature of what had just happened, while Sarah Chen in 4A, a tech entrepreneur whose designer luggage and confident demeanor marked her as someone who traveled frequently and understood the unspoken rules of premium cabin service, looked from Victoria to Jasmine and back again, with the kind of dawning awareness that suggested she was beginning to realize that she was witnessing something that went far beyond simple oversight or accidental service failure. David Kim, meanwhile, hovered near the galley like a nervous bird, his eyes darting between Victoria's carefully controlled movements and Jasmine's calm but watchful presence. And when their gazes met for a brief moment, she could see in his expression the kind of helpless frustration that came from knowing that something was wrong, but feeling powerless to address it without risking his own precarious position in an industry that was notorious for protecting established hierarchies over individual conscience. The boarding process was nearly complete, with passengers settling into their seats and flight attendants going through their final pre-departure checks when Victoria emerged from the galley with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested something significant was about to happen, followed by a red-faced, sweating businessman whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the desperation in his eyes as he clutched a boarding pass that he seemed to believe would solve all his problems if he could just get someone in authority to pay attention to his predicament. Robert Kensington looked like the kind of man who was accustomed to having problems solved by the simple expedient of throwing money at them until they disappeared, his thick neck straining against a collar that had been selected to convey success, but now seemed to be strangling him with its own ambition. And as he stood in the aisle beside row 4, his presence seemed to fill the space with the kind of aggressive entitlement that could make even first-class passengers shift uncomfortably in their premium leather seats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced in her perfectly modulated flight attendant voice, the one that could convey authority and concern. In equal measure, we seem to have encountered a small technical difficulty with our seat assignments this morning. The kind of computer error that unfortunately occurs when our reservation system experiences the sort of glitches that have become more common as airlines rely more heavily on automated processes that don't always account for the complexities of premium passenger service. She gestured toward Kensington with the sort of deference that she had conspicuously failed to show Jasmine, her body language shifting into a mode of professional accommodation that made it clear who she considered to be the legitimate occupant of disputed territory. And the businessman puffed up visibly under her attention, his chest expanding like a peacock displaying its feathers as he prepared to claim what he clearly believed was his rightful place in the hierarchy of commercial aviation. "Mr. Kensington is one of our global services members." Victoria continued, her voice carrying the kind of reverence that suggested she was speaking about royalty rather than someone who had simply spent enough money on airline tickets to achieve a particular status level. And his reservation clearly shows seat 4B, which means there's been some sort of system error with the ticket that was issued to. She paused, letting her gaze fall on Jasmine, with the sort of theatrical timing that would have been impressive if it weren't so obviously calculated. To this passenger who may have purchased her ticket through one of those third-party discount sites that sometimes create these kinds of complications. Jasmine looked up from her notebook where she had been documenting the service failures. She had observed her pen hovering over a page that was rapidly filling with notes about protocol violations and discriminatory treatment patterns. And she could feel the attention of the entire first-class cabin focusing on her, like spotlights on a stage. Passengers who had been minding their own business suddenly becoming unwilling audience members in a drama that was about to reveal something uncomfortable about the nature of privilege and power at 30,000 feet above the ground. "I purchased this ticket directly through the Meridian Airways website," Jasmine said, with the kind of calm precision that came from years of dealing with people who preferred assumptions to facts paid full fare. "And I have the confirmation email and credit card statement to prove it if you'd like to examine the documentation." But Victoria was already shaking her head with the sort of patient condescension that suggested she was dealing with someone who simply didn't understand how the world really worked. Her smile never wavering, even as her eyes grew colder than winter wind. The relocating process unfolded with the kind of inexorable momentum that Jasmine recognized from her years of observing institutional discrimination in action, the way individual choices could combine to create outcomes that seemed almost predetermined. And as she gathered her belongings from seat 4B under the watchful eyes of passengers who were trying to decide whether they were witnessing a legitimate correction of a booking error or something far more troubling, she felt the familiar weight of being reduced to a problem that needed to be managed, rather than a person who deserved basic dignity and respect. Victoria escorted her down the aisle like a prison guard leading an inmate to a cell. Her movements efficient and professional, but somehow conveying an unmistakable message about power dynamics and social hierarchies that didn't require words to be understood by anyone paying attention. And as they passed through the premium economy section and into the main cabin, Jasmine could feel the curious stares of passengers who were witnessing the kind of public demotion that everyone feared could happen to them if they somehow stepped out of line or failed to meet the invisible standards that governed modern air travel. Seat 34E was a middle seat in the very heart of economy class, squeezed between a young mother struggling with a crying infant and a businessman who had already claimed both armrests and seemed to be expanding into her space with the unconscious entitlement of someone who had never been forced to consider the comfort of others. And as Jasmine settled into the narrow space that felt like a compression chamber after the spacious luxury of first class, she could smell the distinctive mixture of recycled air, microwaved food, and human anxiety that seemed to permeate the back of every commercial aircraft in America. But instead of feeling defeated or angry, Jasmine felt the familiar surge of professional focus that came when she was gathering evidence for what promised to be one of the most significant safety and discrimination cases of her career. And she pulled out her phone with movements that appeared casual but were actually quite deliberate, opening the secure FAA communication application that would allow her to send encrypted messages directly to the regional office and begin the process that would turn this flight from a routine audit into a federal investigation. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency as she documented the time, date, flight number, and crew member identification information, along with a preliminary description of the discriminatory treatment she had received and the safety protocol violations she had observed. And as she crafted her message to Regional Director Thomas Crawford, she felt the satisfaction that came from knowing that Victoria Sterling Hayes had just made the kind of career-ending mistake that would serve as a cautionary tale for discriminatory flight attendants for years to come. The message she sent was brief but comprehensive: conducting covert audit flight MR 882. Lead purser T. Sterling Hayes has engaged in blatant discriminatory passenger treatment, forced relocation based on racial profiling, and multiple safety protocol violations. Request ground team preparation for immediate intervention upon arrival. This situation requires full federal response. More documentation to follow. As the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, Jasmine settled back in her uncomfortable seat and smiled with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that justice was not always immediate but was often inevitable, especially when someone made the mistake of targeting a federal inspector who had spent her entire career ensuring that the skies were safe and accessible for everyone regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. The seatbelt sign chimed with its familiar electronic tone as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom system, announcing that they were encountering an area of severe clear air turbulence over the mountains of Pennsylvania. The kind of invisible atmospheric violence that could turn a routine flight into a white-knuckle experience in the space of a few seconds. And as the aircraft began to buck and roll like a wild animal trying to throw its riders, passengers throughout the cabin gripped their armrests and whispered prayers to whatever deities they believed might have influence over the behavior of commercial aviation at 35,000 feet above the ground. "Flight attendants, take your jump seats immediately," the captain's voice commanded with the sort of authority that brooked no argument, the kind of direct order that was supposed to supersede every other consideration aboard an aircraft, including customer service protocols and social hierarchies and personal preferences about where one wanted to be when the laws of physics decided to reassert their dominance over human pretensions of control. But as Jasmine watched the scene unfold from her cramped position in seat 34E, she could see that not everyone was treating the safety directive with the seriousness it deserved. Victoria was still in the forward galley, leaning against the service counter with the kind of casual disregard for federal aviation regulations that would have been shocking if Jasmine hadn't already witnessed so many other protocol violations during her brief time aboard this aircraft, and standing beside her with a crystal tumbler of what appeared to be premium scotch was Robert Kensington, the businessman who had claimed her first-class seat, and was now demonstrating the sort of entitled behavior that seemed to believe that money could purchase exemptions from the basic laws of physics and aviation safety. The aircraft dropped suddenly, a sickening lurch that left Jasmine's stomach somewhere near the overhead bins while her body was pressed down into the seat cushion by forces that reminded everyone aboard that they were essentially passengers in a metal tube hurtling through an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human life. And as she watched Kensington stumble and grab for support, she could see the amber liquid sloshing in his glass, and the way Victoria reached out to steady him with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't their first encounter. Through the gap in the curtain that separated the cabins, Jasmine could observe the intimate conversation between Victoria and her privileged passenger. The way they laughed together about something that struck them as amusing while the rest of the aircraft was being thrown around like a toy in the hands of an angry child. And when Victoria reached for the bottle of wine that was supposed to be secured during turbulence and poured a generous splash into her own coffee cup, Jasmine felt the electric shock of recognition that came from witnessing a federal crime in progress. Alcohol consumption by crew members during flight operations was one of the most serious violations in all of commercial aviation, the kind of career-ending, license-revoking, potentially criminal behavior that could result in immediate termination and federal prosecution. And as she watched Victoria raise the coffee cup to her lips and take a deliberate sip while the aircraft continued to bounce through the unstable air. Jasmine began to understand that this investigation was about to become something much bigger than a simple discrimination case. When Kensington decided that he needed to use the lavatory despite the captain's explicit orders for all passengers to remain seated with their safety belts securely fastened, his journey through the turbulent aircraft became a study in entitled disregard for basic safety protocols, his expensive shoes providing no traction on the carpeted aisle as he lurched from seat to seat like a drunk sailor on a ship in a storm, his face growing greener with each violent motion of the aircraft as his body struggled to process the combination of premium alcohol and gravitational forces that seemed determined to remind him of his fundamental powerlessness in the face of natural laws. He made it as far as row 34 before the aircraft hit an air pocket that dropped them several hundred feet in a matter of seconds, a sensation that felt like falling off a cliff while strapped to a rocket, and his stumbling trajectory brought him crashing into Jasmine's row with all the grace of a falling tree, his considerable bulk slamming into her shoulder with enough force to make her wince, even as her professional training kicked in and she instinctively moved to help steady him and prevent further injury to either of them. "She pushed me," Kensington announced with the indignant outrage of someone who had never been held accountable for the consequences of his own poor decisions. His voice, loud enough to carry throughout the economy cabin and draw the attention of passengers who were already on edge from the turbulence. And as he pointed an accusatory finger at Jasmine, she could see the way his narrative was already forming in his alcohol-impaired mind, a story that would make him the victim rather than the perpetrator of this dangerous situation. Victoria appeared almost instantly, materializing in the aisle with the kind of supernatural speed that suggested she had been monitoring the situation and waiting for exactly this sort of opportunity to further escalate the conflict she had been nurturing since the boarding process began. And as she assessed the scene with her ice-cold eyes, Jasmine could practically see the calculations happening behind that perfectly made-up face, the way personal animosity was combining with professional authority to create a potentially explosive situation. "I am placing you under citizen's arrest for assault on a passenger," Victoria declared with theatrical authority, reaching into her service apron to produce a set of plastic zip-tie restraints that seemed to have been waiting for exactly this moment, her movements deliberate and calculated as she advanced on Jasmine with the confidence of someone who believed that her position gave her the right to physically restrain passengers based on her own interpretation of events, rather than any objective assessment of what had actually occurred. The cabin fell silent except for the continued groaning and creaking of the aircraft as it fought through the turbulent air, passengers straining against their seatbelts to get a better view of the confrontation that was unfolding in their midst. Phones appearing in hands throughout the cabin as people began to document what was clearly becoming a situation that would either end in tragedy or provide content for social media platforms where airline incidents had become a form of entertainment that could generate millions of views and reshape public opinion about corporate behavior in real time. The announcement of their emergency diversion to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport crackled through the cabin speakers with the kind of authority that cut through all other sounds. The captain's voice carrying the weight of federal aviation regulations and the responsibility for the safety of every soul aboard the aircraft. And as the Boeing 787 began its descent toward the nation's capital, Jasmine could feel the shift in atmospheric pressure both inside and outside the cabin. The way tension had been building throughout the flight, like steam in a pressure cooker that was about to reach its explosive release point. Victoria stood in the aisle with her plastic restraints still clutched in her manicured hands, her perfect composure finally beginning to crack around the edges as the reality of the situation began to penetrate the bubble of entitlement and authority that had insulated her from consequences for the better part of 2 decades. And when the aircraft touched down with the controlled violence that marked every commercial landing, she seemed to realize that her window for maintaining control of the narrative was rapidly closing. The jet bridge connected with a solid thump that vibrated through the fuselage, and within moments, the forward door opened to admit a stream of uniformed personnel that included airport security officers, federal agents, and a man in an expensive gray suit who carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He entered his presence immediately shifting the power dynamics aboard the aircraft in ways that Victoria was only beginning to understand. Inspector Washington, Regional Director Thomas Crawford said as he approached row 34, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cabin where every passenger was straining to hear what would happen next. In this drama that had transformed their routine flight into something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. I received your emergency communication, and I want to assure you that we are treating this situation with the utmost seriousness that it deserves. Jasmine stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled as she reached for the hem of her faded university sweatshirt and lifted it slightly to reveal the gold shield clipped to her belt. The Federal Aviation Administration credentials that transformed her from a seemingly powerless passenger into one of the most feared authority figures in all of commercial aviation, someone who possessed the legal power to ground aircraft, revoke licenses, initiate criminal prosecutions, and fundamentally alter the careers and lives of anyone who violated the sacred trust of passenger safety and dignity. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance pressing down on the cabin like a physical force that made it difficult to breathe, and in that moment of crystalline clarity, every passenger, every crew member, and every federal agent present understood that they had just witnessed the kind of perfect storm of arrogance, discrimination, and institutional failure that would be studied in business schools and legal seminars for decades to come as an example of how quickly hubris could transform into catastrophic consequences. Victoria's face underwent a transformation that was visible from anywhere in the cabin, the color draining from her cheeks like water from a broken dam, while her eyes widened with the kind of existential terror that came from realizing that every assumption she had made about power and privilege and the natural order of things had just been revealed as a dangerous illusion that was about to destroy everything she had spent 20 years building. The methodical dismantling of Victoria Sterling Hayes's career proceeded with the inexorable precision of a federal investigation that had been triggered by violations so egregious that they seemed almost designed to serve as a textbook example of how not to conduct oneself in a position of public trust. And as Jasmine read from her documentation in a voice that carried the weight of official authority throughout the now silent cabin, each word seemed to land like a hammer blow on the remnants of Victoria's professional reputation. Denial of service based on racial profiling, violation of passenger rights under federal anti-discrimination statutes, consumption of alcohol while on duty in direct violation of federal aviation regulation. 91.17 failure to secure cabin during announced turbulence and physical intimidation of a federal inspector in the performance of her duties. Jasmine recited with the clinical precision that came from years of conducting investigations, where accuracy and attention to detail could mean the difference between justice and injustice, between accountability and impunity, between a system that worked for everyone and one that protected only those with enough privilege to believe themselves above the law. The portable breathalyzer that Director Crawford produced from his briefcase beeped its electronic verdict with a sound that seemed to echo through the cabin like a church bell tolling the end of an era, the digital display showing 0.06 blood alcohol content, a number that was not only above the federal limit for flight crew members, but represented a level of impairment that could have endangered every passenger aboard the aircraft if an emergency evacuation or other safety procedure had been required during the flight. Victoria's hands shook with tremors that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in her core as she unpinned the silver wings that she had worn with such pride for 20 years, the metallic insignia that had represented not just her profession, but her identity, her sense of place in the world, and her belief that she possessed a special kind of authority that elevated her above the ordinary concerns of ordinary people. And as she placed them in Crawford's outstretched palm, the gesture seemed to mark not just the end of her career, but the collapse of an entire worldview that had been built on foundations that were revealed to be nothing more than sand. Robert Kensington's financial empire began its collapse almost immediately as the federal contractor database was updated to reflect his status as a person under investigation for assault on a federal officer, interference with flight crew operations, and conduct unbecoming a holder of security clearances. Violations that carried not just criminal penalties but administrative consequences that would ripple through every aspect of his business operations for years to come, transforming him from a global services member into a cautionary tale about the true costs of entitled behavior. David Kim, meanwhile, found himself promoted to lead purser on the very next flight. He worked his conscientious behavior during the crisis and his attempts to provide proper service, despite Victoria's interference noted and rewarded by an airline management team that was suddenly very interested in demonstrating their commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance, their race, or their perceived social status. The congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, aviation industry representatives, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens who had followed the story from its viral beginnings to its current status as a catalyst for fundamental changes in how the American aviation system approached issues of discrimination, safety, and accountability. And as Jasmine sat at the witness table with banks of microphones arrayed before her, like the instruments of an orchestra, she could feel the weight of history settling around her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. Dr. Washington. The committee chairwoman began, her voice carrying the gravity that befitted someone who was helping to shape legislation that would affect millions of travelers for generations to come. Your experience aboard Meridian Airways, Flight 882, has sparked a national conversation about discrimination in commercial aviation, and we're hoping that your testimony today will help us understand how we can prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future, ensuring that every American can travel with dignity regardless of their race, their economic status, or any other factor that should have no bearing on their treatment as passengers. The new federal regulations that emerged from those hearings mandated comprehensive bias training for all flight crew members, established anonymous reporting systems for passengers who experienced discriminatory treatment, created undercover audit programs that would be conducted regularly across all major airlines, and instituted financial penalties so severe that airline executives would have no choice but to take discrimination seriously as both a moral imperative and a business risk that could threaten their company's very survival. Meridian Airways underwent a complete leadership restructuring that extended from the corporate boardroom to the individual flight crews, implementing new hiring practices, revised training protocols, and cultural changes that transformed the company from a cautionary tale into a model for how airlines could create inclusive environments that served all passengers equally while maintaining the highest standards of safety and professionalism that the traveling public had a right to expect. Victoria Sterling Hayes found herself unemployable in any capacity related to commercial aviation, her name appearing on industry databases that were shared among airlines, airports, and regulatory agencies as someone whose judgment and behavior had been found fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities that came with ensuring passenger safety and comfort. Her 20-year career reduced to a series of warning flags that would prevent her from ever again having authority over travelers who trusted the aviation system to treat them fairly. The ripple effects spread throughout the industry as other airlines, terrified of suffering similar public relations disasters and federal investigations, proactively reviewed their own policies and procedures, conducted voluntary audits of their service standards, and implemented changes designed to ensure that the discrimination and abuse of authority that had characterized Flight 882 could never happen under their corporate banners, creating a rising tide of accountability that lifted standards across the entire sector. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Jasmine's home office along with the usual collection of official correspondence and industry publications that marked the rhythm of her professional life. But this envelope was different, hand-addressed in the careful cursive of someone who had taken time to make every letter perfect. And when she opened it, she found herself reading the words of a young black woman from Atlanta who had decided to pursue a career in aviation safety after watching the news coverage of Flight 882 and realizing that people who looked like her could hold positions of real authority and responsibility in an industry that had once seemed closed to anyone who didn't fit a very narrow demographic profile. Dr. Washington, the letter began. You probably don't remember me, but I was in the audience during your congressional testimony, and I wanted you to know that your courage in that situation has inspired me to believe that I can make a difference in making air travel safer and more equitable for everyone, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. And I hope that someday I can follow in your footsteps and ensure that no passenger ever has to endure what you experienced on that flight. Jasmine set the letter down on her desk and looked out her window at the clear blue sky where contrails from passing aircraft wrote temporary messages across the heavens, each white line representing hundreds of people who were trusting the aviation system to deliver them safely to their destinations, while treating them with the basic dignity that should be the birthright of every person who purchased a ticket and boarded a plane in America. And she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment to touch something fundamental about justice and equality and the slow but steady progress of a society that was learning to live up to its highest ideals. The photograph on her bookshelf showed her parents at a civil rights march in the 1960s, two young people who had believed that their sacrifices and struggles could create a better world for their children and grandchildren. And as Jasmine reflected on the journey that had brought her from that legacy of activism to her current position as someone who could protect travelers from discrimination and ensure that the skies remained open to everyone, she understood that her work was not just about aviation safety, but about continuing the fight for equality that her parents had begun decades ago. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter, a college senior who was studying public policy and considering a career in civil rights law. Mom just saw another article about the changes at airlines since your case. You're literally changing the world one flight at a time. Dad would be so proud of how you're carrying on the family tradition of fighting for justice. As another aircraft passed overhead, its engines writing a temporary signature across the afternoon sky. Jasmine smiled with the knowledge that somewhere aboard that plane, passengers of all races, backgrounds, and economic circumstances were being treated with equal dignity and respect, not because of her individual actions alone, but because she had been part of a larger movement toward justice that was as inevitable as the rising sun and as powerful as the forces of lift and thrust that carried millions of people safely through the skies every single day, proving once again that the arc of the moral universe, however long, does indeed bend toward justice. If this story of instant karma and long overdue justice moved you, please hit that like button to help us reach more people who need to see that discrimination has consequences, and that sometimes the person you underestimate holds the power to change everything. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove courage and dignity will always triumph over prejudice and entitlement, and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Dr. Washington's position. Would you have revealed your authority immediately or waited for the perfect moment to deliver justice? Your thoughts help us create the content that matters most to you.